Commander Jake Morrison stood perfectly, still as he watched the display screen showing thousands of alien ships moving toward Earth. His hands rested on the console in front of him, and his eyes never blinked as he counted each vessel that appeared on the scan. The bridge of the USS Valiant was quiet except for the soft humming of computers and the occasional beep from the monitoring systems. Lieutenant Amy Carter sat at her station with headphones covering her ears as she listened to the alien communications that their new technology had intercepted 6 months ago. The Zorathian collective had been planning this invasion for almost a year now, and they believed humans had no idea what was coming. Their massive fleet consisted of over 800 warships, including dreadnoughts that were 3 times the size of anything humanity had ever built. The aliens had discussed their plans openly on their communication channels, because they never imagined that primitive humans could break their encryption codes. But Dr. Lisa Green had done exactly that with her quantum entanglement interceptor, which was now installed on every major human vessel in the fleet. Admiral Frank Hayes had been reading those intercepted messages for months and learning everything about Zorathian tactics and strategies. He knew which ships carried their command structure and which ones held their supply lines. He understood their formation patterns and their preferred attack angles. Most importantly, he knew exactly when and where they planned to strike at Earth. The aliens thought they were the hunters stalking helpless prey, but Hayes had turned the tables completely. Humanity was about to teach the Zorathians a lesson they would never forget. Captain Ben Tucker commanded a stealth frigate called the Nightfall, which was currently floating in the darkness beyond Pluto. His ship and 19 others like it were equipped with cloaking technology that the aliens could not detect. Tucker had watched the Zorathian fleet pass right by his position 3 hours ago, and they had no idea he was there. He sent a coded message back to Morrison confirming that the enemy had taken the bait and was moving through the Neptune corridor exactly as predicted. The trap had been set. Over the course of 3 months, with ships being positioned in carefully calculated locations throughout the outer solar system, over 200 human warships were now hiding in the ice fields of the Kuiper Belt, with their reactors running at minimal power to avoid detection. Each captain knew their role, and each crew had practiced their part of the operation hundreds of times. The element of surprise was absolutely critical because humanity was still outnumbered 4-1 even, with their entire fleet assembled. Morrison walked over to where Amy Carter sat and placed a hand on her shoulder. She looked up at him and nodded to confirm that the alien communications were still following the expected pattern. The Zorathians were celebrating already and talking about how easy this conquest would be. Their leader, Warlord Kreth, had promised his warriors that they would feast on human worlds and divide the resources of the solar system among themselves. They spoke of humanity with contempt and called them weak, creatures who barely qualified as intelligent life. What the aliens did not know was that every insult and every arrogant boast had been recorded and analyzed by human intelligence officers. Colonel Ryan Phillips had used that information to create a psychological profile of the enemy commander, which revealed that Kreth was overconfident and prone to making rash decisions when things did not go according to plan. This weakness would be exploited when the battle began. Dr. Helen Price had designed the sensor masking technology that kept the human fleet hidden from Zorathian scans. Her team had created false energy signatures that looked like civilian ships moving between the colonies, while the real military vessels remained invisible. The aliens saw exactly what humanity wanted them to see, which was a defenseless civilization, caught completely off guard. Commander Paul Griffin was leading a small group of old ships near Mars that were broadcasting distress signals and calling for help that would never arrive. This diversionary force was crewed by skeleton teams while the main fleet waited in silence. Morrison returned to his command chair and reviewed the tactical data one more time. The Zorathians would emerge from faster-than-light travel in approximately 40 minutes at a point between Neptune and Uranus. Human ships were positioned in a sphere around that exact location, with overlapping fields of fire that would cover every possible escape route. The plan was to let the entire alien fleet enter the kill zone before revealing the ambush. Timing would be everything, because if even one enemy ship escaped, to warn the collective, then humanity would face an even larger invasion force in the future. Lieutenant Nicole Sanders was aboard the intelligence vessel Shadow, monitoring every frequency the aliens used. She had been listening to their chatter for weeks now, and had become familiar with their various commanders and their personalities. Kreth was the loudest and most aggressive, but there were others who seemed more cautious and professional. Sanders made notes about which ships might surrender quickly once the battle turned against them and which ones would fight to the last warrior. Admiral Hayes stood on the bridge of his flagship, the EFS Defiance, and looked out at the stars. He had spent 40 years in the Navy and had seen humanity grow from a single planet species to a civilization that spanned the solar system. He had watched as colonies were established on Mars and the moons of Jupiter. He had been there when the first faster-than-light engines were tested and when humanity made contact with other alien races. Most of those races had been friendly or at least neutral, but the Zorathians were different. They were conquerors who believed that might made right and that weaker species existed only to serve the strong. Hayes had argued in the council meetings that humanity needed to prepare for war even when others said he was being paranoid. He had pushed for increased military spending and better weapons research. Some had called him a warmonger, but he knew the galaxy was a dangerous place. Now his preparations were about to be tested in the most important battle humanity had ever fought. If they won here today, then the other alien civilizations would respect human strength. If they lost, then Earth and all the colonies would be enslaved or destroyed. Morrison checked the countdown timer showing 30 minutes until the Zorathians arrived. He walked through the bridge looking at each member of his crew and seeing the determination in their eyes. These men and women knew what was at stake and they were ready to do whatever was necessary. The Valiant might not survive the battle, but her crew would make sure they took as many enemy ships with them as possible. That was the human way. When backed into a corner, they did not surrender. They fought. Colonel Ryan Phillips sat in the dark room surrounded by computer screens, showing lines of alien code scrolling past at incredible speeds. His cyber warfare team had been working non-stop for 3 weeks to infiltrate the Zorathian intelligence network without being detected. The aliens used a complex encryption system, but it had one fatal weakness, which was that they never imagined a species as primitive as humanity could possibly break it. Phillips had exploited that arrogance by creating a backdoor into their communications grid that let his team read everything and insert false information whenever needed. The operation had begun small with tiny alterations to sensor data that the Zorathians received from their scout ships. Phillips and his team made Earth defense grids appear weaker than they actually were. They created phantom reports of ships being pulled from active duty for repairs that were not really happening. They falsified supply records to make it look like human colonies were running low on ammunition and fuel. Each lie was carefully crafted to be believable and to build upon the previous deceptions. Dr. Helen Price worked alongside Phillips, coordinating the scientific aspects of the operation. Her specialty was energy signatures and sensor technology. She had developed a method of masking the true power output of human vessels, while simultaneously generating false readings that mimicked civilian traffic. The Zorathians would scan the solar system and see exactly what humanity wanted them to see, which was cargo ships moving between colonies and defensive platforms operating at minimal capacity. Meanwhile, the real battle fleet was charging weapons and preparing for war. Commander Paul Griffin had the most dangerous job of all, which was commanding the diversionary force near Mars. His flotilla consisted of 12 ships that were over 50 years old and officially listed as scheduled for decommissioning. The Zorathians had intercepted those maintenance schedules thanks to information that Phillips had deliberately leaked. They believed these ancient vessels were the last line of defense protecting the inner solar system. Griffin made sure to broadcast plenty of radio chatter about supply shortages and mechanical problems to reinforce that belief. What the aliens did not know was that Griffin's old ships had been completely gutted and rebuilt from the inside. The hulls looked ancient, but underneath they carried the most advanced weapon systems humanity had ever designed. Each vessel had been converted into a missile platform, capable of launching over 200 quantum torpedoes in the first 30 seconds of combat. The skeleton crews operating these ships were all volunteers who understood they might not survive the battle, but were willing to take that risk. Lieutenant Nicole Sanders continued her work aboard the Shadow, listening to Zorathian communications and building psychological profiles of enemy commanders. She had identified 3 major personalities in the invasion fleet. Warlord Kreth was the supreme commander, and his arrogance made him predictable. Admiral Vex was second in command and seemed more professional. but he always deferred to Kreth's judgment. Captain Zarn commanded the advance guard and was known for aggressive tactics that sometimes bordered on reckless. Sanders reported her findings to Admiral Hayes, who used the information to refine the battle plan. If Kreth was arrogant, then he would likely reject any suggestion of retreat even when the ambush was sprung. If Vex always followed orders, then he would not act independently to save his ships. If Zarn was reckless, then he could be baited into making mistakes that would cost him dearly. Hayes studied each commander and planned specific tactics to exploit their weaknesses. The deception campaign reached its peak 5 days before the expected invasion date. Phillips launched the final phase of his operation, which involved creating a fake distress signal from a human colony ship that appeared to be stranded near Uranus. The signal was carefully crafted to sound desperate and to mention that the ship was carrying civilian refugees, including women and children. The Zorathians intercepted the transmission exactly as planned, and Sanders listened. As Kreth laughed about how pathetic humans were, Dr. Lisa Green was responsible for the most important technological breakthrough that made the entire ambush possible. Her quantum entanglement interceptor had cracked Zorathian encryption, but she had also developed the quantum torpedoes that would give humanity a fighting chance. These weapons used quantum tunneling to phase through enemy shields as if they did not exist. The aliens had never encountered this technology, and their defensive systems were not designed to stop it. Green had personally overseen the installation of these weapons on every ship in the fleet. Captain Ben Tucker kept the Nightfall and the other stealth frigates on station beyond Pluto, maintaining absolute radio silence. His crew ate cold meals and spoke in whispers to avoid any chance of detection. They watched the Zorathian scout ships pass by on their sensors, knowing that one mistake could compromise the entire operation. Tucker had served under Hayes for 15 years and trusted the Admiral completely. If Hayes said the plan would work, then Tucker believed him. Morrison received regular updates from all elements of the operation through encrypted tight beam transmissions that the Zorathians could not intercept. He watched as each piece of the puzzle fell into place. The enemy fleet was following their predicted route. The human ships were in position and ready. The deception was holding with no signs that the aliens suspected anything. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. But Morrison knew that no plan survived. First contact with the enemy. Lieutenant Amy Carter had been monitoring Zorathian communications for so long that she could recognize individual voices among their command staff. She listened as Kreth held a conference with his senior officers discussing how they would divide the spoils after conquering Earth. Some wanted to enslave humans and put them to work in mines. Others argued for complete extermination to prevent any future resistance. Kreth decided they would make that choice after seeing how the initial invasion went. Carter felt her anger rising as she listened, but she channeled it into determination to make them pay for their arrogance. Admiral Hayes called a final meeting with his senior staff 2 days before the invasion. Morrison attended via video link from the Valiant along with the other ship captains. Hayes reviewed the plan one last time and emphasized that discipline would be critical. No one was to open fire until he gave the order. The ambush had to be sprung at exactly the right moment when the entire Zorathian fleet was inside the kill zone. If they attacked too early, then some enemy ships would escape. If they waited too long, then the aliens might detect the trap. Phillips confirmed that his team would continue feeding false information to the Zorathians right up until the moment of attack. Price verified that all sensor masking systems were functioning properly. Green reported that quantum torpedo inventories were at maximum levels. Griffin stated that his diversionary force was ready to play their part. Tucker sent word that the stealth frigates remained undetected. Sanders provided updated intelligence on enemy command structure and recommended priority targets. Morrison listened to all the reports and felt confident that humanity had done everything possible to prepare. The Zorathians were walking into a trap that had been laid with patience and precision. They thought they were about to destroy a weak and helpless species, but instead they were going to collide with human ingenuity and determination. The element of surprise combined with superior tactics and new weapons technology would hopefully offset the enemy numerical advantage. Soon the galaxy would learn that humans were not prey. The Zorathian armada emerged from faster-than-light travel in a brilliant flash of blue light that lit up the darkness between Neptune and Uranus. 800 warships materialized in perfect formation, with the massive dreadnoughts at the center surrounded by layers of cruisers and destroyers. Warlord Kreth stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Devastator, and smiled as his sensors showed no human military presence anywhere nearby. The pathetic creatures had not even detected his arrival, which confirmed everything his intelligence reports had told him about their primitive technology. Captain Steve Warren watched from his position aboard the carrier Valkyrie as the alien fleet settled into their formation and began moving toward the inner solar system. His ship was hiding in the ice fields along with 40 other vessels, maintaining complete power and communication silence. The reactor was running at barely 5% capacity, which made the Valkyrie look like just another chunk of frozen rock to enemy sensors. Warren could see his breath in the cold air of the bridge because they had shut down life support to everything except minimal levels. Commander Jake Morrison counted the enemy ships as they appeared and compared the numbers to intelligence predictions. The Zorathians had brought exactly 812 vessels, which matched what Lieutenant Nicole Sanders had estimated based on intercepted communications. Every major warship that the collective possessed was here, because Kreth wanted overwhelming force for his glorious conquest of humanity. The alien commander had gathered his entire military in one place, which was exactly what Admiral Frank Hayes had hoped for. And Lieutenant Amy Carter opened a secure channel to all human ships using a frequency that the Zorathians could not detect. She transmitted a single code word, which was the signal that the enemy had arrived, and the ambush would proceed as planned. 200 warships began powering up their reactors in perfect synchronization. The process was slow and carefully controlled to avoid sudden energy spikes that might alert alien sensors. It would take 15 minutes to bring all systems online, but the Zorathians would be well inside the kill zone by then. Captain Ben Tucker gave the order aboard the Nightfall, and his stealth frigate came alive. The cloaking system remained active, but weapons systems began charging and targeting computers locked onto priority enemy vessels. Tucker had been assigned to eliminate the Zorathian communication ships in the opening seconds of the battle. If the enemy could not coordinate their forces, then their numerical advantage would be significantly reduced. 19 other stealth frigates were targeting similar high-value assets throughout the alien formation. Warlord Kreth received a report from his sensor officer stating that the fake distress signal from the human colony ship had stopped transmitting. He ordered a cruiser to investigate while the main fleet continued toward Earth. The sensor officer also mentioned some unusual readings from the Kuiper Belt, but dismissed them as background radiation from ice collisions. Kreth barely listened because he was already imagining his triumphant return to the collective homeworld. After crushing humanity, Admiral Hayes stood calmly on the bridge of the EFS Defiance as his ship's reactor climbed to full power. Around him, 200 other vessels were doing the same, creating a sphere of human warships that completely surrounded the Zorathian fleet. The aliens were trapped, but they did not know it yet. Hayes had waited his entire career for this moment. He had studied every major battle in human history and learned from the mistakes of commanders who had fought without proper preparation. Today would prove that intelligence and strategy could overcome superior numbers. Morrison watched his tactical display as green dots representing human ships began appearing around the red mass of Zorathian vessels. The sphere was closing with mathematical precision. Every ship was exactly where it was supposed to be, and every weapon system was coming online according to schedule. The Valiant's main railguns were charged and ready. Missile tubes were loaded with quantum torpedoes. Point defense systems were active and tracking potential threats. His crew worked with quiet efficiency born from months of drilling for this exact scenario. Commander Paul Griffin's diversionary force near Mars suddenly came to life, broadcasting frantic messages about detecting the Zorathian fleet. His ships began accelerating toward the outer system, as if rushing to defend Earth from the invasion. The Zorathians intercepted these transmissions, and Kreth laughed at the pathetic attempt by obsolete human vessels to challenge his armada. He ordered Admiral Vex to detach 50 ships to destroy Griffin's force, which was exactly the reaction Hayes had predicted. The sphere of human warships reached full power at the same moment. 200 reactors blazing at maximum output created an energy signature so massive that every Zorathian sensor suddenly screamed warnings. Kreth spun toward his sensor officer, demanding to know what was happening. The officer's face turned pale as he reported that human warships had appeared in every direction surrounding the fleet completely. The trap had been sprung and there was no escape. Captain Steve Warren launched his fighters before the aliens could react. 500 small craft poured from the Valkyrie, and 19 other carriers accelerating to attack speed instantly. Lieutenant Kelly Morgan led Red Squadron straight at the Devastator while her wingman Aaron Blake covered her approach. The Zorathian point defense systems began firing, but they had not been expecting an attack from this direction, and their targeting was... Poor Hayes opened a communication channel on all Zorathian frequencies, and his voice echoed through every enemy ship. He identified himself and informed Kreth that the collective had walked into a perfectly planned ambush. He explained that humanity had been reading their communications for 6 months and knew everything about their invasion plans. He offered one chance for surrender before the battle began. The bridge of the Defiance was silent as everyone waited for the alien response. Warlord Kreth's reply came in the form of a screamed order to attack. His pride could not accept that primitive humans had outsmarted him. He commanded his fleet to break through the human sphere in any direction and destroy everything in their path. Admiral Vex tried to suggest a more measured response, but Kreth silenced him with a roar. The Zorathian ships began turning to engage the nearest human vessels without any coordinated strategy. Morrison saw the alien formation start to break apart as individual ships chose different targets. This was the chaos that Hayes had predicted. An arrogant commander faced with unexpected defeat would panic and abandon tactical discipline. The human fleet maintained its sphere formation and prepared to engage. Every captain waited for the order from Hayes. The silence stretched for 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. The tension was unbearable. Hayes gave the command in a voice as cold as space itself. Fire. 200 human warships opened up simultaneously with every weapon they possessed. The void between Neptune and Uranus erupted in light and flame, as thousands of missiles and energy beams converged on the Zorathian fleet from all directions. The quantum torpedoes phased through shields and struck hull armor directly. Railgun rounds traveling at significant fractions of light speed punched through dreadnoughts like they were made of paper. Captain Ben Tucker's stealth frigates fired their opening salvo, at the same moment targeting the Zorathian communication vessels. 20 ships died in the first 5 seconds before the aliens even knew the stealth craft were there. The enemy fleet was suddenly blind and deaf, unable to coordinate their response. Individual ships were fighting alone against an enemy that had total information superiority. Lieutenant Amy Carter monitored the alien communications as they dissolved into chaos and panic. Ship captains were screaming for orders, but Kreth was not responding. Some vessels tried to surrender immediately, but others fought on out of loyalty or fear. The Zorathian formation that had looked so impressive moments ago was now a confused mob being systematically destroyed. By precise human fire, Morrison's Valiant engaged 3 Zorathian cruisers that tried to break through the human sphere near his position. The enemy ships were larger but slower, and their weapons could not penetrate the Valiant's shields. Morrison's crew worked like a machine, with each person executing their role perfectly. Lieutenant Chris Martinez directed the railgun batteries while Amy Carter coordinated point defense and communications. The 3 cruisers lasted 90 seconds before they were reduced to drifting wreckage. The battle had become a massacre. The Zorathians were outnumbered in every engagement, because the human sphere formation meant that multiple ships could focus fire on individual targets. Enemy vessels that tried to flee ran directly into another section of the human fleet. Those that stood and fought were overwhelmed by superior firepower and tactics. Kreth had brought his entire military to destroy humanity, and instead he had delivered it into the hands of destruction. The void burned with the fury of dying starships as the battle reached its peak intensity. Commander Jake Morrison gripped his command chair as the Valiant shuddered under enemy fire from a Zorathian dreadnought that had managed to get close enough to use its main weapons. The shields held, but the power drain was significant. Lieutenant Chris Martinez adjusted firing solutions and launched a full salvo of quantum torpedoes that phased through the dreadnought's defenses and detonated inside its reactor core. The massive alien warship broke apart in a blinding explosion that lit up the darkness for hundreds of kilometers. Captain Steve Warren's fighter squadrons danced through the chaos, engaging enemy vessels that tried to target the human carriers. Lieutenant Kelly Morgan had already destroyed 4 Zorathian fighters and damaged 2 cruisers. Her wingman Aaron Blake stayed close, providing cover as they dove toward the Devastator, where Warlord Kreth was still attempting to command his shattered fleet. The alien flagship was surrounded by a protective screen of smaller ships, but Morgan was determined to punch through and deliver her payload directly to Kreth's bridge. Dr. Lisa Green's quantum torpedoes were proving even more effective than predicted. The Zorathian shields that had seemed so formidable were completely useless against weapons that could tunnel through normal space. Enemy commanders who had never lost a battle were now watching their vessels explode around them, with no understanding of how humanity had developed such devastating technology. Every human ship was equipped with these torpedoes, and they were firing them as fast as the launch tubes could cycle. Commander Paul Griffin's diversionary force had abandoned their pretense of being weak and outdated. The 50 Zorathian ships that Admiral Vex had sent to destroy them were now desperately trying to escape. Griffin's vessels had revealed their true nature, launching wave after wave of missiles that overwhelmed enemy point defenses. The aliens had expected easy targets, but instead found themselves fighting cutting-edge warships disguised in ancient hulls. Within minutes, half of Vex's detachment was destroyed, and the rest were retreating back toward the main fleet. Captain Ben Tucker's Nightfall had expended all of its initial missile load and was now using railguns to pick off damaged enemy vessels. The stealth frigate remained cloaked, moving through the battlefield like a ghost and striking targets that never saw the attack coming. Tucker's crew worked with deadly efficiency, identifying priority targets and eliminating them before moving on to the next. They had personally destroyed 12 Zorathian ships, and the battle was not even 30 minutes. Old Admiral Frank Hayes watched the tactical display aboard the EFS Defiance and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The battle was unfolding exactly as planned, with human forces maintaining perfect coordination, while the enemy floundered in chaos. The Zorathian numerical advantage meant nothing when their ships could not work together effectively. Hayes ordered his flag captain to focus fire on the Devastator, because killing Kreth would break whatever morale the aliens had left. Lieutenant Nicole Sanders continued monitoring Zorathian communications from aboard the Shadow. She heard the panic in alien voices as they realized they were losing badly. Some captains were begging Kreth for permission to retreat, but the warlord refused to acknowledge that his perfect invasion had turned into a nightmare. Other commanders had stopped waiting for orders and were making their own decisions. Sanders counted at least 30 ships that were trying to surrender by shutting down their weapons and broadcasting peaceful intentions on all frequencies. Morrison received orders from Hayes to cease fire on any vessel that surrendered and to disable them with electromagnetic pulse weapons instead of destroying them. The Valiant shifted targets and began working with 3 other ships to systematically knock out enemy vessels that had given up the fight. Lieutenant Amy Carter opened channels to these ships and instructed them on proper surrender procedures. Some Zorathian captains seemed relieved to be taken prisoner rather than dying in a hopeless battle. The human sphere formation was slowly contracting and tightening around the remaining enemy ships that still fought. Every minute that passed saw more Zorathian vessels destroyed or disabled. The aliens had started the battle with 812 warships, but now less than 400 remained operational. Human losses were much lighter, with only 11 ships destroyed and 23 seriously damaged. The casualty ratio was running 10-1 in humanity's favor, which was almost unheard of when fighting a numerically superior force. Captain Steve Warren's Valkyrie took a direct hit from a Zorathian dreadnought that had broken through the fighter screen. The carrier's shields collapsed and hull breaches were reported on 3 decks. Warren ordered damage control teams to the affected areas and returned fire with every weapon that could still shoot. The dreadnought was already damaged from previous attacks, and Warren's bombardment finished it off. The huge ship listed to one side and then exploded as its ammunition magazines cooked off in a chain reaction. Lieutenant Kelly Morgan finally reached attack range on the Devastator and launched her remaining missiles at the flagship's bridge section. Aaron Blake covered her escape as Zorathian point defenses tried desperately to shoot down the incoming ordnance. 2 missiles got through and struck the bridge tower, causing massive damage. Morgan did not know if Kreth had been killed, but at minimum the flagship's command center was crippled. She pulled up hard to avoid debris and began looking for her next target. Warlord Kreth was not dead, but he was injured, and his bridge was in ruins. Fires burned everywhere, and half of his command staff were casualties. His sensor officer reported that over half the fleet was gone, and human ships were closing in from all sides. Kreth finally understood that he had led his entire civilization's military to destruction through arrogance and stupidity. Admiral Vex, who had survived the bridge hit, tried one more time to convince Kreth to order a retreat before it was too late. Morrison watched as the Devastator's engines suddenly flared to life and the flagship tried to break out of the human sphere. Several other Zorathian ships followed their commander, attempting a desperate escape. Hayes had anticipated this and had positioned his fastest cruisers to block any breakout attempt. The Defiance and 6 other ships intercepted Kreth's run and hammered the Devastator with concentrated fire. The flagship's remaining shields collapsed and its engines died, leaving it drifting helplessly. Commander Paul Griffin's force had finished off the detachment that Vex sent against them and was now joining the main battle. His ships added their firepower to the human sphere, and the rate of Zorathian losses increased even more. Griffin targeted a cluster of enemy destroyers that were trying to protect a damaged dreadnought. His quantum torpedoes made short work of the destroyers, and the dreadnought surrendered. Immediately after losing its escorts, the battle had been raging for 90 minutes when Admiral Vex finally managed to take command of what remained of the Zorathian fleet. Kreth was unconscious from his injuries and could no longer prevent his subordinate from making the only logical decision. Vex broadcast a general surrender on all frequencies and ordered every Zorathian ship to power down weapons and engines. He knew that continuing to fight would only result in complete annihilation. At least by surrendering now, he could save some of his people. Captain Ben Tucker received the surrender order and stopped firing. Around the battlefield, human ships ceased their attacks as Zorathian vessels went dark. The sudden silence was eerie after the chaos of combat. Tucker looked around his bridge at his exhausted crew. They had done their jobs perfectly, and humanity had won a victory that would echo through the galaxy. The species that came to destroy Earth had been utterly defeated. Hayes accepted the Zorathian surrender and immediately ordered search and rescue operations to begin. Human ships that had not been damaged in the fighting moved among the wreckage, looking for survivors from both sides. Dr. Helen Price led medical teams that began treating wounded aliens alongside injured humans. Hayes knew that showing mercy to a defeated enemy would send a powerful message to the rest of the EA galaxy about human character. Morrison walked through the corridors of the Valiant, checking on his crew and assessing damage. The ship had taken a beating but would survive. 18 members of his crew had been killed and another 30 were injured. He made sure to visit the medical bay and speak with everyone who was conscious. These people had trusted him to lead them in battle, and they had performed magnificently. The Valiant had destroyed or disabled 21 enemy vessels, which was more than any other ship except the Defiance. Lieutenant Amy Carter was compiling casualty reports from across the fleet. 3,042 humans had died in the battle. 18 ships had been destroyed completely. The numbers hurt to look at, but they were far better than anyone had dared hope. The Zorathians had lost over 600 ships and at least 200,000 warriors. The aliens had paid a terrible price for their arrogance and their plan to exterminate humanity. The debris field stretched across millions of kilometers and represented the shattered remnants of what had been the most powerful invasion fleet ever assembled by the Zorathian collective. Admiral Frank Hayes stood on the observation deck of the EFS Defiance and looked out at the wreckage. Pieces of destroyed warships tumbled slowly through space, catching the distant light of the sun. Human rescue vessels moved among the debris, pulling survivors from damaged ships and providing emergency medical care. Hayes had ordered that all survivors be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of whether they were human or alien. Warlord Kreth sat in the detention bay of the Defiance with his head in his hands. His injuries had been treated by Dr. Helen Price herself, who had worked on him with the same care she gave to human patients. Kreth could not understand why these creatures he had planned to exterminate were now saving his life. He had called humans weak and primitive, but they had defeated him utterly through superior intelligence and tactics. Everything he believed about the galaxy had been proven wrong in the span of 2 hours. Commander Jake Morrison supervised repairs aboard the Valiant while his crew worked to patch hull breaches and restore damaged systems. The ship would need weeks in a repair dock to be fully operational again, but she could make it back to Earth under her own power. Lieutenant Amy Carter was still at her communication station, coordinating with other vessels and relaying status reports to Admiral Hayes. She had not slept in over 30 hours, but refused to leave her post until every survivor had been accounted for. Captain Steve Warren walked through the hangar bay of the Valkyrie, counting the fighters that had returned. He had lost 43 pilots in the battle, including some who had been under his command for years. Each empty berth represented someone who would never come home, and Warren felt the weight of those losses heavily. Lieutenant Kelly Morgan was among the survivors, and Warren personally thanked her for the attack run that had crippled the Devastator. Morgan simply nodded and went to help the maintenance crews prepare her fighter for the flight back to base. Captain Ben Tucker finally powered down the Nightfall's cloaking system and revealed his ship's position to the rest of the fleet. His stealth frigates had performed flawlessly during the battle, accounting for over 100 enemy ships destroyed. Hayes sent a personal message congratulating Tucker on his squadron's performance and noting that their successful elimination of Zorathian communication vessels had been critical to the victory. Tucker accepted the praise but knew that every member of his crew deserved equal recognition. Lieutenant Nicole Sanders was analyzing the communications data she had collected during the battle. The psychological profile she had created of enemy commanders had been accurate and had allowed Hayes to predict their responses to the ambush. Admiral Vex's decision to surrender once he took command proved that not all Zorathians were mindless warmongers. Sanders was already working on a report that would help humanity understand their defeated enemy and perhaps build a foundation for future peace. Dr. Lisa Green inspected the remaining quantum torpedo inventory and was pleased to see that human ships still had over 30% of their ammunition left. The battle had been won decisively without exhausting their weapons stocks, which meant the fleet could respond to any follow-up threat from the collective. Green was already thinking about improvements to the torpedo design based on combat data. She also needed to ensure that the technology remained secret, because the element of surprise had been a huge advantage. Commander Paul Griffin's diversionary force joined the main fleet and began assisting with rescue operations. His ships had suffered minimal damage because the Zorathian detachment sent against them had been quickly overwhelmed. Griffin visited the detention areas where captured alien officers were being held and was struck by how defeated they looked. These warriors had expected an easy victory and glorious conquest, but instead found humiliation and captivity. Griffin felt no sympathy for them given what they had planned to do to humanity. Admiral Hayes called a meeting with his senior staff to discuss the aftermath of the battle and plan next steps. Morrison attended along with Warren and Tucker and Griffin and the other ship captains. Hayes began by acknowledging the courage and sacrifice of everyone who had fought. He read the names of the ships that had been lost and called for a moment of silence to honor the dead. Then he turned to practical matters of securing the prisoners and salvaging useful technology from captured vessels. The intelligence value of the captured Zorathian ships was enormous. Human engineers would be able to study alien reactor designs and weapon systems and propulsion technology. More importantly, the aliens' computers contained detailed information about the collective, including the locations of their homeworlds and the strength of their remaining military forces. Colonel Ryan Phillips was already working with teams to extract this data before the Zorathians realized how much they had given away. Hayes decided that humanity needed to send a clear message to the rest of the galaxy about what had happened here. He ordered Lieutenant Amy Carter to prepare a complete record of the battle, including video from human ships showing the ambush and the defeat of the invasion fleet. This record would be transmitted to every known alien civilization, along with a statement explaining that humanity desired peace but would defend itself with absolute determination against any aggressor. Morrison was assigned to oversee the interrogation of Admiral Vex, who had agreed to cooperate in exchange for better treatment of his surviving crew. Vex explained that the collective had made a catastrophic mistake by underestimating humanity. He admitted that Zorathian intelligence services had been arrogant and lazy, assuming that a species without faster-than-light travel until recently could not possibly threaten the collective. That arrogance had led directly to the greatest military disaster in Zorathian history. Captain Steve Warren was put in charge of organizing the trip back to Earth with the fleet and the captured enemy vessels. The journey would take several weeks, even at maximum speed, because many ships were damaged and needed to travel slowly. Warren created a formation that put the most combat-capable vessels on the outside, protecting the damaged ships and the transports carrying Zorathian prisoners. He assigned fighter patrols to watch for any possible rescue attempt, though intelligence suggested the collective had no remaining military assets to send. Lady. News of the victory reached Earth 2 days after the battle, and celebrations erupted across the planet and throughout the colonies. People who had been preparing for invasion and possible extinction instead learned that their military had won a crushing victory. The name Admiral Frank Hayes became known to every human alive. Streets were renamed and monuments were planned. Hayes himself remained focused on getting his people home safely and did not pay attention to the growing legend surrounding him. Warlord Kreth finally agreed to speak with Hayes after spending a week in detention. The two commanders met in a secure conference room with guards present. Kreth asked why humanity had shown mercy to an enemy that planned genocide. Hayes explained that humans fought to defend themselves, not to prove their superiority. He said that defeating the Zorathians in battle was necessary, but that treating prisoners with dignity was a choice that reflected human values. Kreth admitted he did not fully understand, but that he was grateful to be alive. The journey back to Earth took 3 weeks, and during that time, human crews worked alongside Zorathian prisoners to repair damaged vessels. Dr. Helen Price reported that this cooperation was helping to break down the
hostility between the species.
Some of the younger Zorathian warriors had never questioned their leaders' propaganda about humans being inferior. Working side by side with human engineers and seeing their skill and compassion was changing minds and hearts. Lieutenant Nicole Sanders interviewed dozens of captured Zorathian officers and compiled a comprehensive analysis of the collective government and military structure. She learned that Kreth's aggressive policies had been controversial even among his own people. There was a faction within the collective that had opposed the invasion, but been overruled by the militarists. Sanders believed this faction could be potential allies in negotiating a lasting peace. Commander Jake Morrison spent much of the return voyage writing letters to the families of his crew members who had died. Each letter was personal and specific, mentioning something unique about the person who had been lost. Morrison knew these letters could never truly ease the pain of those families, but he felt it was his duty to let them know their loved ones had died bravely in defense of humanity. He finished the last letter 2 days before the fleet reached Earth orbit. The arrival of the victorious fleet was broadcast live across Earth and all the colonies. Millions of people watched as over 180 human warships entered orbit, along with the captured Zorathian vessels. Admiral Hayes gave a brief speech thanking his forces and honoring those who had fallen. He ended by stating that the Battle of the Kuiper Belt, as it was now called, had proven that humanity would never surrender to those who threatened extinction. The galaxy had learned that humans were not prey, but protectors of their own destiny. Captain Ben Tucker was awarded the Star of Valor along with E.